opposite, okay? So when we hear inverse, I want you to think it's the opposite. Now, we're going to read the two statements there that are on your paper. The first one I think is a little wordy. It's a little confusing. The second one makes a little bit more sense. So it says a function's domain is its inverse's range. A function's domain is its inverse's range. So there's that idea of opposites. And a function's range is its inverse's domain. So like I said, a lot of wordy, confusing. Let's look at the second sentence. The domain and the range of a function are switched to produce the domain and the range of the function's inverse. I think that one makes a little bit more sense. We switch domain and range of the function to get the domain and range of the inverse. So let's go over a little notation here. Over that little box, I want you to put f of x over function. Here is inverse notation. It looks like a -1 exponent. It is not a -1 exponent. Okay, you cannot use exponent rules or anything like that. That is the notation for the inverse. Okay, so you can see there in that box it says that for the function, the original domain and the original range. Domain x, we're used to that. Range y, we're used to that. Look at the inverse. For the x's, it says it's the original range. For the y's, it's the original domain. So over here to the side, I want you to also write f inverse of x switches x and y values. F inverse of x switches x and y values. So what do I mean by that? Let's look at example 1 to make a little bit more sense of that. Example 1 says, what are the domain and the range of the inverse of this function? Now, they don't give us a rule. They just give us a list of points. So that list of points is the original function. Let's list the points of the inverse. Okay, so f inverse here, and sometimes they leave off the x. In this case, they've left off the x. They just use f for the function, so we'll just use f, and it looks like a -1 exponent. Okay, what we do is we switch x and y. So if -7, +3 is a point on the original, +3, -7 is a point on the inverse. Positives and negatives stay, but the x's and y's switch places. So if -4, 1 is on the original, 1, -4 is on the inverse. -3, 5 is on the original, 5, -3 is on the inverse. 0, 7 is on the original, 7, 0 is our inverse. 3, 8 is the original, 8, 3 is on the inverse. And finally, 10, 8 is the last point of our inverse. So the question didn't really ask us what are the points. It asked what are the domain and range of the inverse. So now that we have switched the x's and y's, let's list the domain and the range. So domain, x values, range, y values. So the x values of the inverse, we're not looking at the original anymore. We're looking at the x values of the inverse. Let's list them in numeric order, least to greatest. So 1, 3, 5, 7, 8, and 10. And that's how you list the domain if it's just a set of points. Okay, for the range, let's list those in numeric order. -7, -4, -3, 0, 3, and 8. Okay, that's it. Now, technically, we did not have to list out all the points for the inverse. Technically, you did not have to list it out like this. You could just look at the original and use that idea of opposites. So if I want to talk about the domain of the inverse, that is actually the y values of the original. The domain of the inverse, the x values of the inverse, are the y values of the original. Okay, f inverse x values are y values of f. And the same is true about the y values. Okay, so I'm going to put domain above x values, range below y values. Okay, so f inverse x values are y values of f. The domain of f inverse is the range of f. So, lots and lots of words. Any questions so far? Okay. Let's look at, I want to do one more just to make sure we're on the same page. I want to do number 3 because I want to point out a little detail. Okay, I want to point out a little detail. So on number 3, f inverse domain, I'm not going to switch all the x's and y's just to save myself some room in writing and time. Okay, so the domain of the inverse are the y values of my original. I want to list them in order from least to greatest. So -5 was the least, then -4, then we have 0. 0 appears twice. You only list it once. Okay, if it appears multiple times as a y value or as an x value, you only list it once. And then 1 is also repeated twice. We just list it once when we're listing it in our domain. For the range, that's the x values of the original. So -10, -9, 4, 5, 6, and 10. So none of those repeated. I think that it's kind of helpful maybe kind of mark them off as you write them down so that you don't miss any. And I wanted to do this one to point out that your domain and range don't always have the same amount of numbers. Okay, because our domain had 2 repeated values, so we only have 4 numbers listed, but they represent 6 points. There are actually 6 points in that function, and we don't list them if they're repeated. Okay, so pretty simple idea.